7-year-old Zoe had a best friend named Mr. Whispers, who only she could see. Her mom, Cassidy, always smiled at Zoe's stories, thinking it was all playful imagination. But one day, Zoe shared something that made Cassidy's heart skip a beat, something unexpectedly real about Mr. Whispers. Cassidy never thought she'd dial the police over Zoe's imaginary tales until the day her daughter described a place she should have never known about. Cassidy's hand shook as she dialed the local police number. She looked at her daughter, who was happily playing, totally unaware of the horror she had just told her mother. "Hello? Please send Officer Matthew home. It's a family emergency," Cassidy quietly said, hoping Zoe wouldn't hear her. She walked to the other room to talk more freely, as the dispatcher wanted to know why she needed an officer. Cassidy heard her own voice tremble as she told the dispatcher it was hard to explain. "Just send him home, please. Our daughter just told me something upsetting about the Miller case." Upon hearing that name, the dispatcher stopped asking questions and told Cassidy that Officer Matthew was on his way. Cassidy returned to Zoe, who was now coloring, and looked at the piece of paper. "Who's that?" Cassidy asked, trying to hide the worry in her voice. "That's Mr. Whispers," Zoe excitedly said. She had drawn a man in the middle of the paper, next to a house all colored in black, and with 3 little stick-figure children beside him. Above them, she had colored the sky black. "This is what he shows me at night," she eerily added. A chill ran down Cassidy's back as she forced out a smile. "That's beautiful," she softly said, but from the inside she was screaming. "Can you tell me more about him?" she cheerfully asked, hoping her interest would seem genuine and help open Zoe up. But as soon as she had asked that, Zoe's eyes darted to the ground. "He told me to keep it a secret for now." Cassidy bit her lip. She could see Mr. Whispers had some kind of grip on her daughter, and it broke her heart. She tried to remember when she had lost sight of Zoe, where he could have talked to her, or when he could have taken her to that house. But the only times she didn't have Zoe by her side were when Zoe was at school. Zoe's father arrived home, looking bewildered. "I came as fast as I could," he said, expecting to walk into something horrible. He instantly loosened up when he saw Zoe calmly drawing, with Cassidy sitting beside her. "I was in the middle of something. This better be important," he hissed, as Cassidy pulled him toward the kitchen. "It's about James Miller," she coldly said back. Matthew's eyebrows furrowed as he looked at his wife. "That case has been closed for years," he began, but Cassidy didn't let him finish. "Our daughter knows things about that case you don't even know," she said, her face as serious as could be. That struck a nerve in Matthew, as he had been the lead officer on the case 3 years ago. He stormed out of the kitchen and approached his daughter urgently. "Zoe, who is Mr. Whispers?" he asked her, or almost ordered her, as he used his interrogation voice. Zoe immediately bounced back, scared of her father's unexpected irritation. Cassidy ran after him, pulling Zoe behind her. "This is not the way, Matthew!" she snapped at him, pointing at the tears welling up in Zoe's eyes. Zoe's hurt snapped Matthew back to reality as he realized he had lost his cool in front of his daughter. "I'm so sorry, Zoe Bug," he said as he knelt down in front of her to give her a hug. Zoe fell into his arms, softly sobbing. "Mr. Whispers never yells at me," she said softly. Cassidy saw the hurt on her husband's face as he realized his daughter compared him to another man, a probably dangerous man. Matthew had to return to the station, so Cassidy wrote down what Zoe had told her earlier on, a note. Mr. Whispers showed her the red door in the basement. Matthew's face turned pale as he read the note, and Cassidy nodded in silence. Neither of them spoke a word, but their shared worry was clearly sensible. Their daughter was in danger. You see, the Miller case wasn't just a random case that ran cold. 3 years ago, the Miller family lived where Cassidy and her family live now. The father, James, and the mother, Rona, lived there with their 2 sons, Kevin and Keanu, who were both around Zoe's age when tragedy struck. A tragic house fire destroyed everything. Officer Matthew had been the first one to arrive at the scene after the police station had received a chilling call. He had found Rona, Kevin, and Keanu unresponsive in the basement behind a red door. Flames surrounded them, and he had gotten there just in time to get them out. After that, the fire department arrived, but there was nothing they could do to save the house. Officer Matthew had watched the house burn down, a knot forming in his stomach as he had feared James still being inside. But when the fire department searched through the ashes of the house after it had burned down completely, they concluded no body had been found. So where was James? The investigation revealed that the fire was no accident. It was arson. Had James something to do with it? After the case ran cold due to lack of evidence and James still being missing, Matthew and his family bought the Charred house from Rona, as she didn't want to live there anymore. Neither Matthew nor Cassidy had ever spoken to Zoe about the red door or about what had happened to the house, so it was truly shocking she knew about it. Officer Matthew walked into the station, his face serious. He went straight to his desk and grabbed the Miller case file. His colleagues noticed his tense demeanor. "I need to talk to the captain," he said, urgency in his voice. The room quieted as he passed by, his focus unbroken. He knew he needed to reopen the Miller case, and he wouldn't take no for an answer. "Captain, we need to reopen the Miller case," Matthew said firmly. His superior looked up from his paperwork, eyebrows raised. "Why now, after all this time?" he asked. Matthew took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "My daughter knows details she shouldn't. It's not just her imagination." The captain leaned back in his chair, considering Matthew's words. "Tell me everything," he finally said, eyes narrowing in interest. The captain sighed, rubbing his temples. "Matthew, kids have vivid imaginations. Are you sure she isn't just making this up?" Matthew clenched his fists, frustration bubbling up. "She knew about the red door in the basement," he replied, his voice steady. The captain shook his head slowly. "That's still not enough to reopen a closed case." Matthew could feel his hopes slipping away but remained resolute. "She knows more, Captain," he insisted. "Captain, Zoe couldn't have known," Matthew said, almost pleading now. "All the case documents were kept here, locked away." The captain looked thoughtful, tapping his pen on the desk. "You're saying there's no way she could have stumbled on this information?" Matthew nodded, eyes locked on his superior. "Exactly. She described things only someone involved could know." The captain's gaze softened slightly, a hint of doubt creeping in. "All right," he said slowly. "You have 1 month," the captain finally said, leaning forward. "Find something concrete, or the case stays closed." Matthew nodded, relief washing over him. "Thank you, Captain. I won't let you down." He turned to leave, determination in his stride. As he walked out, he knew he had a lot of work ahead. There was no time to waste. Zoe's safety depended on it. The captain watched him go, still uncertain. Matthew wasted no time once he got home. He carefully placed hidden cameras in every room, focusing especially on Zoe's bedroom. "I need to make sure she's safe," he muttered to himself. Cassidy watched him, worry etched on her face. "Do you really think this will help?" she asked softly. "I have to try," Matthew replied, determined. He adjusted the last camera, hoping it would capture any unusual activity. The next morning, Matthew called Zoe's school. "Please keep an extra eye on her during recess," he requested. The school secretary sounded surprised but agreed. "We'll make sure she's supervised," she assured him. "Thanks," Matthew said, feeling slightly better. He hung up the phone, hoping this precaution would help. Cassidy gave him a hopeful look. "Maybe they'll notice something," she suggested. Matthew nodded, though he still felt uneasy. Later that day, the school called Matthew. "Mr. Thompson, we've noticed Zoe hasn't been in school for a week," the secretary said. Matthew's heart dropped. "What do you mean? I didn't call her out," he replied, shock evident in his voice. "We assumed you had called about her absence," she explained. Matthew felt a cold chill. "I need to see all records of recent calls," he demanded her gently. Matthew hurried to the school to get the call recordings. I need to hear every call made regarding Zoe's absence, he told the principal. The principal looked concerned, but complied. We'll gather all the recent recordings, she said, leading him to the office. Matthew's mind raced with questions. Who had called in pretending to be him? And why? The principal handed him a USB drive with the recordings. Back at the station, Matthew plugged in the USB drive and played the recordings. His heart pounded as he listened. This is Matthew Thompson, calling about my daughter Zoe, a voice said. Matthew's blood ran cold. It wasn't his voice. He played it again, this time more intently. He recognized something familiar in the voice but couldn't place it. He knew he had to dig deeper. Matthew pulled up old recordings of James Miller. He played them side by side with the school call. This is Matthew Thompson, calling about my daughter Zoe, the voice repeated. He listened carefully, noting every inflection. It sent chills down his spine. He knew that voice. He paused the playback, heart racing. It can't be, he whispered to himself, realizing the truth. The voice was unmistakably James Miller's. Matthew played the recordings again, this time with more certainty. Every word, every nuance matched perfectly. He couldn't believe it. James Miller was alive and somehow interacting with Zoe. His mind raced, connecting dots he wished didn't exist. It's him, Matthew muttered, horrified. He ran a hand through his hair, feeling a wave of dread. James wasn't just a memory, he was a threat, and Zoe was in danger. Matthew stared at the screen, his resolve hardening. I won't let him hurt her, he vowed quietly. He grabbed his phone and dialed Cassidy. It's him, Cassidy, James Miller, he said, voice shaking. Cassidy gasped on the other end. What do we do? She asked, fear evident. I'm going to find him. I'll keep Zoe safe, Matthew promised. He ended the call, determination setting in. He had to act now. Matthew spent the night formulating a plan. He mapped out the house, pinpointing the best places for cameras and microphones. I'll catch him in the act, he said to himself, determined. He set up motion sensors and reviewed the camera feeds. Cassidy watched him work, worry etched on her face. Be careful, she whispered. Matthew nodded, focused on his task. He knew he had one chance to stop James. The next morning, Matthew woke up early. He watched Zoe board the school bus, then got into his car. I'll stay close, he thought, starting the engine. He followed the bus discreetly, keeping a safe distance. Zoe waved from the window, unaware of his presence. Matthew's heart pounded as he tailed the bus, eyes scanning for any sign of James. He was ready for whatever came next. Matthew followed the bus at a distance, careful not to raise suspicion. He kept his car several vehicles back, ensuring Zoe wouldn't spot him. His heart pounded as he drove, eyes glued to the yellow bus. Just stay safe, he whispered. He couldn't afford to lose sight of her. Not now. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, ready for anything that might happen next. At the school, Matthew watched as Zoe got off the bus. She waved to a few friends but didn't head toward the building. Matthew's brow furrowed. Where is she going? He wondered, tension rising. He kept his distance but moved closer, trying to see what she was up to. Zoe glanced around, making sure no one was watching. Then, she took off running, heading around the back of the school. Matthew followed Zoe's path, staying hidden. She darted behind the school, into a secluded area where no one could see. Matthew's heart raced as he crept closer, trying to keep her in sight. What are you doing, Zoe? He murmured. He watched her stop and look around, then continue running. She seemed to know exactly where she was going. Matthew felt a knot form in his stomach. As Matthew watched, a gray car pulled up near the secluded area. Zoe ran straight to it and climbed inside. No, 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 Matthew muttered, panic setting in. He recognized the car from somewhere, but he couldn't place it. He grabbed his phone, ready to call for backup, but hesitated. I need to follow them, he decided. He started his car, keeping his eyes on the gray vehicle. Matthew's heart pounded as he tailed the gray car through winding streets. He kept a safe distance, careful not to lose them. The car weaved through traffic, heading toward the outskirts of town. Where are they taking her? He wondered, anxiety gnawing at him.
Also, if you have not done so already, please subscribe to our channel and click that notification bell to get inspired by these real-life stories every day. Now, back to the story.
He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, determined not to let them out of his sight. Every turn brought new tension. The car finally stopped at an old, abandoned warehouse on the town's outskirts. Matthew parked a safe distance away, heart pounding. The building looked even more ominous in the early morning light. He watched as the car's engine turned off. What is he doing here? Matthew thought, anxiety clawing at him. He needed to see more but had to remain unnoticed. He reached for his camera, determination setting in. Matthew grabbed his camera with the telephoto lens, carefully adjusting it. He stepped out of his car quietly, staying low. Every movement was calculated, ensuring he stayed hidden. He found a good vantage point behind some overgrown bushes. "I need evidence," he reminded himself. With steady hands, he focused the lens on the car. He was ready to capture whatever happened next, hoping it would provide the answers he needed. Matthew began taking pictures, his finger clicking the shutter rapidly. He zoomed in on the car, capturing every detail. The windows were tinted, making it hard to see inside. He adjusted his position slightly, trying to get a better angle. "Come on, show yourselves," he whispered. His camera whirred, recording each moment. He knew these photos could be crucial in proving what was going on with Zoe and James Miller. Matthew stayed hidden, observing the situation closely. He scanned the area, noting any possible threats. The warehouse looked deserted, but he didn't let his guard down. Any second now, he thought, feeling the tension build. He adjusted his camera, ready to capture the moment they exited the car. His breath was shallow, every muscle tensed. He couldn't afford to miss a thing. Zoe's safety depended on it. Matthew's heart nearly stopped as he saw Zoe exit the car, holding hands with James Miller. He snapped several photos, documenting the encounter. Relief washed over him, seeing Zoe unharmed, but terror gripped him, seeing her with Miller. What is he doing with her? Matthew wondered, dread filling him. He kept taking pictures, each click of the shutter echoing his growing fear. He knew he had to act soon. Relief and terror mixed in Matthew's chest as he saw his daughter unharmed, but with a dangerous man. Zoe looked calm, unaware of the danger. James held her hand, leading her toward the warehouse. Matthew's mind raced. What is he planning? He kept snapping photos, every image crucial. "Stay strong, Zoe," he whispered. The sight of her safe brought relief, but the threat James posed fueled his fear. James led Zoe inside the warehouse, unaware of the surveillance. Matthew watched through his lens, heart pounding. He captured every step they took, documenting their movements. The large, rusted doors creaked open, swallowing them into the darkness. This can't be good, Matthew thought. He knew he had to act fast. As the doors closed behind them, he lowered his camera and reached for his phone, hands shaking slightly. Matthew quickly called the station, his voice urgent. "I need backup at the old warehouse on the outskirts," he said, keeping his eyes on the building. The dispatcher's voice was calm but concerned. "What's the situation?" they asked. "It's James Miller. He has my daughter," Matthew replied, trying to stay calm. "We're on our way," the dispatcher assured him. Matthew ended the call, praying help would arrive soon. Matthew described the situation in detail to the dispatcher, ensuring backup approached discreetly. "They mustn't know we're coming," he emphasized. "Miller is dangerous, and my daughter's with him." The dispatcher confirmed they'd move in quietly. "Hang tight, Matthew. Help is on the way." He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. Every second felt like an eternity as he waited for backup to arrive, eyes fixed on the warehouse. Backup arrived silently, and Matthew coordinated the operation. He met with the team behind his car, quickly briefing them. "We need to surround the warehouse without alerting Miller," he instructed. The officers nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Move in pairs, stay low," Matthew added, his voice firm. He watched as they dispersed, taking their positions. "We're getting you out, Zoe," he thought, determination fueling his every move. The team surrounded the warehouse without alerting James. Each officer took their position quietly, moving like shadows in the early morning light. Matthew held his breath, watching the building intently. "Everyone in place?" he whispered into his radio. A series of quiet affirmations came through. He nodded to himself, steeling his nerves. "On my mark," he instructed, eyes never leaving the warehouse doors. The tension was palpable. They quietly breached the building, moving in formation through the dimly lit rooms. Flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the dusty interior. The team advanced with caution, every step deliberate. Matthew led the way, his senses heightened. "Stay sharp," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The air was thick with anticipation. They moved deeper into the warehouse, each room bringing them closer to Zoe and James. Matthew spotted Zoe sitting on a crate, happily chatting with James. Relief washed over him seeing her unharmed, but the sight of her so comfortable with Miller was unsettling. He motioned for the team to stop. "There they are," he breathed, his eyes narrowing on James. Zoe's innocent laughter echoed in the cold, empty space. Matthew knew it was time to act. He took a deep breath, readying himself. "James Miller, this is the police. Put your hands where I can see them," Matthew shouted, his voice echoing through the warehouse. James froze, his smile fading. Zoe looked up, confusion and fear clouding her eyes. "Daddy?" she whispered, tears starting to form. The team moved in, weapons drawn. James slowly raised his hands, a look of resignation on his face. Matthew's heart pounded, but he stayed focused. Zoe, confused and scared, looked at her father with tears in her eyes. "Daddy, what's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. Matthew wanted to rush to her, to hold her and tell her everything would be okay. "It's going to be all right, Zoe," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The officers moved in, their focus on James. Zoe clung to her father's words, but the fear remained. Officers swiftly moved in, cuffing James and leading him away from Zoe. James didn't resist, but his eyes were locked on Zoe. "It's okay, Zoe," Matthew called out, trying to reassure her. Zoe's eyes were wide with confusion and fear. James was led out of the room, and the tension began to lift. Matthew took a deep breath, relieved but knowing there was still much to explain to his daughter. Matthew approached Zoe, who was still sitting on the crate. She looked at him with tear-filled eyes, unsure of what was happening. "Daddy?" she said softly. Matthew knelt down and pulled her into a hug. "It's okay, sweetie. You're safe now," he whispered, feeling her small body tremble. Zoe clung to him, seeking comfort and answers. Matthew stroked her hair, trying to calm her down. "You're safe with me," he repeated. Matthew held Zoe tightly, whispering reassurances that she was safe. "Everything's going to be okay, Zoe," he murmured. "I'm here now." Zoe's sobs began to slow, but she was still visibly shaken. Matthew continued to hold her, rocking gently back and forth. "I won't let anything happen to you," he promised. The warmth of his embrace seemed to calm her, but he knew she was still confused by the events. Zoe clung to him, comforted but confused by the events. "Why did they take Mr. Whispers?" she asked, her voice small and unsure. Matthew took a deep breath, thinking of how to explain. "Mr. Whispers isn't who you thought he was," he began gently. "He's someone who did bad things, but you're safe now." Zoe looked up at him, her eyes wide with understanding and lingering fear. Officers secured James, ensuring he couldn't harm anyone. They double-checked the cuffs and kept a close watch on him. "We've got him, Matthew," one officer said, giving a reassuring nod. Matthew, still holding Zoe, felt a wave of relief. "Thank you," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. Zoe looked back at James as they led him away, her grip on Matthew tightening. "It's over now," Matthew whispered to her. Matthew carried Zoe out of the warehouse, grateful she was unharmed. The bright morning sun hit them as they stepped outside, a stark contrast to the dim interior. Matthew felt a rush of relief and gratitude. He kissed Zoe's forehead, thankful this ordeal was over. "We're going home," he said softly. They left the scene, heading back to the station for further steps. Matthew drove with one hand, the other resting reassuringly on Zoe's leg. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Zoe nodded, still a bit dazed. "I'm just tired, Daddy," she murmured. Matthew gave her a comforting smile. "We'll be at the station soon, and then we can go home," he promised. He glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the warehouse disappear. In the interrogation room, James began to speak, voice trembling. "I never meant to hurt anyone," he said, eyes darting nervously. Matthew stood behind the glass, watching closely. "Why did you take Zoe?" the officer asked firmly. James swallowed hard. "I needed your attention. I had no other way," he admitted. His hands shook, the reality of his situation sinking in. Matthew felt a mix of anger and curiosity. James revealed he had vanished to escape a dangerous gang. "They threatened my family," he confessed, voice barely above a whisper. "I thought if I disappeared, they'd leave them alone." The officer leaned in, interested. "Why involve a child?" he asked. James looked down, guilt written all over his face. "I was desperate. I knew Matthew would protect her," he said. Matthew's mind raced, piecing together this new information. James faked his death to protect his family from the gang's threats. "I didn't see any other way," he explained, tears welling up. "They said they'd kill us all if I didn't comply." The officer took notes, eyes narrowing. "And you thought disappearing would solve it?" he asked skeptically. James nodded. "I had to do something drastic." Matthew, listening in, felt a strange mix of understanding and frustration. The story was far from over. "I used Zoe to get your attention," James admitted, voice heavy with regret. "I knew you wouldn't ignore her." Matthew felt a pang of anger, but also a hint of understanding. "Why didn't you just come to me?" he asked. James looked up, eyes pleading. "I didn't think you'd believe me. I needed to make sure you listened." Matthew sighed, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. James's confession shed light on his desperate actions and hidden motives. "I was trapped, Matthew," he said, voice trembling. "The gang had eyes everywhere. I thought disappearing was the only way to keep my family safe." Matthew listened, feeling a mixture of emotions. "But involving Zoe?" he questioned. James nodded, ashamed. "I was out of options. I knew you'd protect her, just like you did back then." Officer Matthew sat silently, processing the revelation about James. The room felt heavy with unspoken words. He glanced at James, seeing the man's fear and regret. "You put my daughter at risk," Matthew said quietly. James nodded, tears in his eyes. "I know, and I'm sorry," he whispered. Matthew took a deep breath, trying to reconcile his feelings. The situation was more complex than he'd imagined. Understanding James's desperation, he arranged a private reunion. "You'll get to see them," Matthew told James. "But under supervision." James nodded, gratitude and fear in his eyes. Matthew made the call, setting up the meeting. He knew it was a risk, but he also saw the importance of closure for James's family. As he waited, he hoped this reunion would bring some peace to everyone involved. Rona, Kevin, and Keanu arrived, tearfully reuniting with James in custody. The sight was heart-wrenching. Rona rushed to James, her sobs filling the room. Kevin and Keanu clung to their father, tears streaming down their faces. "We thought you were gone forever," Rona cried. James held them as best as he could with cuffed hands, his own tears flowing freely. Matthew watched, feeling the deep emotional weight of the moment. James embraced his family, tears flowing as they held each other. Rona sobbed into his shoulder, while Kevin and Keanu clung to him tightly. "I'm so sorry," James whispered, his voice breaking. The room was filled with the sound of their crying, a mixture of relief and sorrow. Matthew watched from a distance, feeling a pang of empathy. This family had been through so much, but they were together now. Matthew felt a bittersweet sense of closure, knowing redemption and a new beginning were possible. As he observed James's reunion, he realized that sometimes people did desperate things out of love. Maybe there's hope after all, he thought. The case wasn't over, but this moment of reconciliation brought a sense of peace. Matthew knew the road ahead would be tough for James's family, but they had a chance to heal. Matthew drove home with Zoe, both quiet from the day's events. The car ride was filled with silence, each lost in their thoughts. Zoe leaned against the window, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "Are you okay, sweetie?" Matthew asked softly. Zoe nodded, her gaze distant. "Just tired, Daddy," she replied. Matthew reached over and squeezed her hand gently. "We'll be home soon," he assured her, focusing on the road ahead. At home, Cassidy hugged Zoe tightly, relieved to have her back. "I was so worried," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Zoe hugged her mother back, feeling safe in her arms. Matthew stood nearby, watching the reunion with a smile. "We're all together now," he said, feeling a wave of gratitude. Cassidy looked up at him, her eyes full of questions. "Tell me everything," she urged gently. Matthew explained the basics to Cassidy, avoiding too much detail. James was trying to protect his family, he said. Cassidy listened intently, her expression a mix of shock and understanding. "So, he wasn't trying to hurt Zoe?" she asked. Matthew shook his head. "No, he thought it was the only way to get my attention." Cassidy sighed, relief washing over her. "I'm just glad she's safe now," she said softly. The family spent the evening together, grateful for Zoe's safety. They sat around the dinner table, sharing a quiet meal. Zoe talked about her favorite stories, her voice gradually returning to normal. Matthew and Cassidy listened, exchanging relieved glances. "We're so proud of you," Cassidy said, smiling at Zoe. The warmth of their home felt even more precious after the day's events. They cherished every moment, thankful to be together. They knew healing would take time, but they faced it together, stronger as a family. "We'll get through this," Matthew said, his arm around Zoe. Cassidy nodded, holding Zoe's hand. "One step at a time," she added. Zoe smiled, feeling the love and support surrounding her. The events of the day had brought them closer, reminding them of what truly mattered. Together, they were ready to face whatever came next.